The numbers say the Falcons will be more methodical rather than explosive on offense under Desmond Ridder. And if so, we're breaking down if they have what it takes to be super efficient in the red zone like they need to be in order to succeed with that style on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers. Follow in their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be talking all about the Falcons' red zone offense. We kind of talked a little bit about, whether or not last week I teased, in the next episode, we'll talk about the team being explosive. Well, we'll focus on the lack of explosiveness and therefore the need for them to be very efficient in the red zone today. Probably later in the week, we'll talk about the explosiveness. But this stems from a tweet that I saw from a former Locked On Falcons guest from Derek Klassen from last week. And I'll throw it up there on the screen for you guys that are watching the video version of the podcast that drops on YouTube the night before the audio drops. Another reason to go ahead and give us that like on YouTube. Go ahead and subscribe, all that and more. But the tweet says from Derek Klassen at QB Class on Twitter, he has had the thought that the way Dak Prescott commands both the run and the pass game, as well as Dallas's overall structure, probably led to a lot of long touchdown drives, methodical, efficient player. Dallas finished with 22 10-plus played touchdown drives last year. Only the Eagles with 23 had more. And the reason why this tweet is notable to me, because it made me think of Desmond Ridder for two reasons, right? The first being the Dak Prescott comparison, right? Where people that tend to like Desmond Ridder and his potential in the NFL tend to compare him favorably to Dak Prescott as a quarterback, as Derek mentioned, that is very, process driven, very high level processor. And if you listen to this podcast last year when we drafted Desmond Ridder, I did my detailed scouting report of him. Dak Prescott was my ceiling comp for Desmond Ridder in terms of the best version of the player that I think Desmond Ridder has the potential to be. And maybe later this summer, we will explore the various reasons and aspects and compare and contrast Desmond Ridder to Dak Prescott. But the second reason why this tweet stood out to me, because it made me think, how did the Falcons fare in this metric, this 10-plus play scoring drive, as well as 10-plus play any drives? But it gets to the root of the explosive versus non-explosive offense that, you everydayers that listen to this podcast know is a big talking point on this podcast. And from my perspective on football, the need to be explosive. We heard Desmond Ridder earlier this summer on Good Morning Football talk about the Falcons' goal of being more explosive. And the reason for that, if you're not quite an everydayer, right, and you don't know quite my view on explosiveness, it stems from, needing to flip the field position and get those chunk yards off of explosive plays. And to me, the research I've done over the last decade plus, there is a high correlation between the best offenses in the NFL as well as those that are the most explosive, that basically it comes from the methodical long drive, are hard to pull off in the NFL consistently at a high level because of essentially third downs. Third downs are hard to convert, right? Rarely in the NFL does a offense convert more than half of their third downs, right? It's usually like 45% makes you an elite third down offense in the NFL. And basically what that means is basically if you get to the second, third down on a single drive, the odds turn against the offense. And this is why, guys, people like Dean Pease, the Falcons' former defensive coordinator, and so many other defensive-minded head coaches and coordinators play that bend but don't break style. It's not most aesthetically pleasing type of defense, I know, for a lot of fans out there and observers, but it is effective due to the fact that it is hard to string together successful plays, time and time again over the course of a game, not only on one drive, but multiple drives that you will need in order to win football games. And so I did the research and looked up how many of these 10 plus play drives the Falcons went on under Desmond Ridder in his final 4 starts. And the answer was 10 over those final 4 games, which during that span of 4 games would have ranked second in the NFL behind the Kenny Pickett-led Pittsburgh Steelers during that span. And if you extrapolate that 4-game sample to a full 17-game season, that would be over 42 of those 10-play drives, which would, again, be second behind the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then I was continuing to do a deep dive into this area. And, I also learned that 8 of those 10 plus play drives that the Falcons had under Desmond Ridder did wind up reaching the red zone during that 4-game sample. And again, you extrapolate that over 17 games, that would equal about 34 10 plus play drives that reached the red zone. And that would have been, over the course of an entire season, would have been the most in the NFL. The Chargers actually led the league with 31 of those 10 plus play red zone drives last season. But the thing that stood out when you look up those numbers is the Falcons only scored touchdowns on 25% of those red zone drives, right? Which would have been the lowest mark in the league over the course of a full season. The 2 teams that finished at the bottom of the league in terms of 10 plus play red zone conversion rate was the New York Jets and the New England Patriots with 33%. And then you compare the Falcons 25% to that, as well as the league average, which was 53%. And you see that the Falcons struggled in that arena relative under Desmond Ridder relative to the rest of the league. And that brings us to the point of, is that something that Desmond Ridder can improve upon in 2023? And I went back and watched the film from 2022, and you'll get my thoughts on what I saw from the film. There's ups and downs from Desmond Ridder when it came to red zone execution, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you to make a fast break to FanDuel for the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's right, $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. And whether you want to bet on the NBA Finals, you want to bet on the upcoming NBA Draft, you want to bet on the upcoming NFL season, whether you want to bet on the Falcons Super Bowl odds, the Falcons NFC South winning odds, or, Bijan Robinson winning Offensive Rookie of the Year, or you can bet, of course, on Major League Baseball and a variety of sports over at FanDuel, because there's no better place than America's #1 sports book. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and you'll get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's talk a little bit more about the Falcons' red zone efficiency. And there is a little bit of context that we need for looking at these numbers with Desmond Ridder and the Falcons in those final 4 games, that you can easily argue that the 25% touchdown conversion rate in the red zone on those longer drives is not necessarily reflective of the reality, right? That one of those 10 plus play drives came at the end of the Cardinals game, where the Falcons were essentially running out the clock, and probably if they wanted to score, maybe could have scored. Another one came in that same game where the Falcons had a long drive. They had to settle for a field goal. Why? Because Desmond Ridder hit Cordero Patterson in the end zone on a back shoulder fade, and which should have been a touchdown, but Patterson dropped that football. And then another came the week before against the Baltimore Ravens, where we saw Cordero Patterson run for a touchdown, and it got called back by a very dubious holding call against Olamide Zaccheaus. So I know you can play the coulda, woulda, shoulda, but I think if you were to look at those 3 long drives and just change the outcome of 2 of those, you would get to that 50% touchdown efficiency that would be league average. So I think when we look at this Falcons team and their red zone efficiency under Desmond Ridder on these long drives, is not necessarily looking from them going from worst to first or something like that. It's more like they're already probably average, and it's about trying to get better than average in that regard. So that, I think, context is necessary in this conversation. But we recently spent a week on this Locked On Falcons podcast, this illustrious show that you're now tuned into. talking all about Desmond Ridder and why he needs to get better against man coverage, as that may be a major weakness. We also could probably spend a lot of time talking about Desmond Ridder improving in the red zone as a way for him to take that next step as a passer, although we probably don't need to spend a whole week on it because I think it's pretty self-evident. I don't necessarily think I have to explain to many of you how important it is to score in the red zone. But I would say at first glance, Desmond Ridder was fine in the red zone. He had a passer rating of 93, which is right there with the NFL average last year of 94 when it came to red zone efficiency. But I don't think the first glance at those numbers truly tell the whole story. And so I went back and watched every red zone throw that Desmond Ridder made in those final 4 games. And as you guys well know, while I generally thought of Desmond Ridder's 4-game performance, I thought reasonably highly of it and what he put out there on film that made me feel like, this guy can be an effective to good starter in the NFL. Some of the negatives, if I was going to be more nitpicky about that, I would probably say a good percentage of the issues I had with Desmond Ridder's film in those 4 starts would have come based off of red zone plays. And, I think the offense is going to be overall fine when it comes to the Falcons in the red zone, just because of how effective this team is running the football. We saw that under Desmond Ridder, as well as Marcus Mariota. It didn't really change from the change at quarterback. The Falcons still ran the ball roughly about 65% of the time on their red zone plays. I think it was exactly 66% of the time under Desmond Ridder. And you compare that to the rest of the league, they have a run pass split in the red zone of 49-51. So the Falcons are running the ball far more than the 49%, roughly 50-50 split that the rest of the league is doing in the red zone. And, I thought Ridder's performance in the red zone was mostly fine, especially when he didn't have to throw the ball in the end zone, right? If he could throw the ball, at the 10 or the 5-yard line, and hopefully his receiver could make a move and, do their thing, he was fine and efficient. But when he had to throw the ball on target in the end zone, that's where I think things tended to break down a little bit. And we also know, again, one of the reasons why red zone efficiency is so self-evident, as I pointed out earlier, is because we know your ability to hit those throws in the red zone can kind of make or break your ability to win football games. You go back to this podcast in September when I was being critical of Marcus Mariota and his performance. Most of that criticism, centered on his red zone performances, right? Because the difference between, if you get into the red zone 4 times, and the difference between converting 2 of those into touchdowns versus 3 of those into touchdowns can cost you a game. That can determine the outcome of whether or not you win or lose a game, because we know that 25% of NFL games over the last couple of years have been decided by 4 points or less, right? And that's basically the difference between you scoring 3 points on one red zone trip versus scoring 7 points on that same red zone trip. And that can be the difference between going 7-10 and 11-6 over the course of a season if you're not able to consistently convert in the red zone. So I could certainly point out other issues that Ridder showed on film in the red zone. We saw that near pick 6 he had in his first game against the New Orleans Saints, where he kind of just forced the ball, and fortunately the defensive back didn't catch it because he would have went to the house. You had the intentional grounding against Baltimore the following week, where that was a questionable decision from Desmond Ridder. And then you had a missed throw on a wide open pass 2 weeks later to Tampa Bay, to Olamide Zaccheaus against Tampa Bay. Fortunately, Ridder did hit Zaccheaus later in the game on a wide open pass. But those are the types of plays that you need to see your quarterback make, or at least those are the types of plays in the case of the pick 6 and the intentional grounding, you need to see your quarterback avoid in the red zone, because those can be backbreakers. And so it's understandable why quarterbacks of all experience, whether they're young quarterbacks like Desmond Ridder or veteran quarterbacks like a Matt Ryan, who was, historically average when it came to the red zone, why they struggle in the red zone, because everything gets cluttered. And, that's really where the speed of the game, and especially for young quarterbacks, you expect those guys to struggle a little bit more than the veterans. But for that reason, we will cut Ridder some slack when it comes to the red zone struggles from last year and potentially this year. But as it was the case with Mariota, I do think he does deserve to be scrutinized when it comes to the red zone, because it will potentially, determine the outcomes of games. So if he's not getting the job done in the red zone, that's going to be a problem for this football team this upcoming season. So now we turn our attention to whether or not the Falcons have really set up Ridder for success in the red zone, particularly by looking at the weapons that the Falcons have surrounded him with that will allow him to be more efficient and effective in the red zone, because we know that over those final 4 games, he wasn't necessarily, playing with a stacked deck, so to speak. So we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But again, I want to give a shout out to all my everydayers out there that check out this show each and every day as their first listen. And for those of you that will be tuning in tomorrow for your first listen, we will probably get deeper into the whole explosiveness and talk about whether or not the Falcons have the pieces around Desmond Ridder to be an explosive offense, in addition to some of the things that we need to see from Desmond Ridder in that area as well. But that's in store for you. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by following on YouTube, subscribing on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. So the question is, did the Falcons do enough this offseason to surround Ridder with a good supporting cast to help him in the red zone? And obviously the big addition that the Falcons made this offseason was, of course, Bijan Robinson. And, we're not going to be spending too much time on today's episode focusing on the Falcons ground game and how Bijan is going to help that. We spent so much time over the last month or so talking about that, because that doesn't necessarily really apply to what we're talking about today, which is Ridder's passing efficiency in the red zone. So I do think adding Bijan will be good for the team. And to be clear, despite expressing some concerns about Ridder in the red zone, overall, I'm not too worried about the Falcons' ability to convert in the red zone because of how much they rely on the running game and how effective I expect the running game to be. So I'm not really panicked about the overall efficiency of the red zone offense when it comes to the Falcons putting points on the board. I'm very optimistic that, their red zone offense will be more than fine this upcoming season because of their ability to run the football when it comes to that. And we may discover that the red zone offense, at least from a passing standpoint, mostly centers on, checking the ball down to Bijan Robinson and just watching him break 3 or 4 tackles and scoring touchdowns. That may be as simple as it gets, guys. He has that type of ability. So certainly that would absolutely help Desmond Ridder's efficiency in the red zone if they could just rely on Bijan just trucking dudes, inside the 5-yard line pretty consistently on these sort of checkdowns. And so he might be a cheat code, but we're not really considering that here. We're really focused on the other weapons that, the receivers and tight ends. And speaking of the tight ends, I think one of the big additions that the Falcons have made this offseason when it comes to improving their supporting cast, when it comes to the red zone, is adding Jonnu Smith, right? That when you go back to the Arthur Smith offense in Tennessee in 2019 and 2020, it was Jonnu Smith, not A.J. Brown. Jonnu Smith was the most targeted player in the red zone in those Smith-led Titans offenses. And we talked about this 2 years ago, back when the Falcons selected Kyle Pitts, right? As kind of one of the justifications for why the Falcons would, quote unquote, overdraft a tight end like a Kyle Pitts, because we know that tight ends were a big part of the Arthur Smith offense. We weren't worried about the tight end scoring touchdowns then, because so much of the Arthur Smith offense, especially in the red zone, ran through the tight end position. About 40% of the Titans' red zone targets, whether that was to Jonnu Smith or Anthony Ferguson or other guys, went to tight ends in those 2 years. And you compare that to the last 2 seasons Arthur Smith has run the Falcons, only about 29% of their red zone targets have gone to the tight end position. But we've talked before about Jonnu Smith not particularly being the most efficient third down target, but his red zone numbers were very effective. And while I didn't necessarily do a deep dive on his old Titans film when it came to his red zone targets, I did go back and watch some YouTube highlights of all his touchdowns. And a lot of those came in the red zone. And you saw Arthur Smith using Jonnu Smith in similar ways that we saw Arthur Smith use Michael Pruitt last year. A lot of play action, rollout concepts, leak and throwback concepts to Jonnu Smith to take advantage of his skill set. And you also saw some slants and some fades and some lobs. And hopefully we'll continue to see those same concepts used by Arthur Smith when targeting Jonnu Smith. And that certainly will allow Desmond Ridder and this offense to succeed when they throw the ball in the red zone. But you would also love it even more if they would use those same concepts for a certain other tight end by the name of Kyle Pitts. And hopefully this is the year where we can kind of nip this whole Kyle Pitts doesn't score touchdowns thing in the bud, right? And we fixed so many long-standing issues, right? As you guys can tell on my whiteboard behind me, we've solved the salary cap situation. We've solved the Falcons' offensive line issues, at least seemingly. We can run the ball now. We got Grady some help because the expectations are that the Falcons will have something close to, if not better than, a league average pass rush this year. And I'm sure you guys can come up with another list of things that you have been complaining about the Falcons not being able to do for a number of years. And, the fact that they've been able to solve so many of these other areas that we've been complaining about for years and years is a reason why myself and so many others have been, so excited and optimistic about this, new phase, new era of Falcons football. But can we now finally solve the problem that's been plaguing this team for the better part of a decade, where we have one of the most dynamic weapons in the entire NFL on offense, but he never seems to score touchdowns? And of course, that began with Julio Jones basically a decade ago and has continued with Kyle Pitts these last couple of years. And so I'm hoping we'll see more Kyle Pitts involved. Obviously, I'm hoping that Drake London and that connection that he and Ridder have will also be an asset to enhance this red zone efficiency this upcoming season. And then you took a look at the other weapons that the Falcons have added this offseason, Mack Hollins. And it's understandable when you look at a receiver with Mack Hollins' size that you think, okay, this is going to help the Falcons be more efficient in the red zone. However, the numbers don't necessarily show that from Mack Hollins' career, where only about 23% of his red zone targets over the course of his career have turned into touchdowns. And you compare that to, say, Kyle Pitts, who was 16%, and Russell Gage, who was not necessarily known for being a great red zone player for the Falcons for years, was 20%. And to be fair to Mack Hollins, though, when you look at the league as a whole, on average, only 23% of all passes that are attempted in the red zone turn into touchdowns. So that indicates that Mack Hollins isn't really adding a whole lot, but he isn't also hurting you in that regard, where if that's the average number. So we'll see if Arthur Smith can do a better job of taking advantage of Mack Hollins' size than the previous play callers that have had him in Philadelphia, Miami, and of course, Las Vegas most recently. And by the way, because, the brand is strong, got to compare Mack Hollins to some other receivers that potentially could be options for the Falcons. Mack Hollins' red zone efficiency was 23%. By the way, Hunter Renfrow's was 34%. Corey Davis, 24%. However, under the 2 years that Corey Davis played under Arthur Smith in Tennessee, it was 50%. So clearly, the Falcons have an opportunity to upgrade, maybe, possibly. And again, I want to make it clear this, I'm not anti-Mack Hollins, guys. I sat here before the 2022 free agency and said I think the Falcons should sign Mack Hollins as a great bargain buy. And basically what he did in Las Vegas last past season was kind of what I was hoping when I came up with that idea he could do potentially in Atlanta. But what I'm saying is, what I'm not saying is I don't think Mack Hollins being your number 2 is going to necessarily doom the Falcons' season or anything like that. Mack Hollins is perfectly fine as a number 2 wide receiver. I'm just saying that if you're quote unquote settling for Mack Hollins being your number 2, in my humble opinion, that to me is a team that's not really trying. No team in the history of the NFL has ever said, who should be our number 2? Mack Hollins. And I don't think the Falcons are breaking new ground by being the first team to do so. So call me crazy when I sit here that at some point in the next 5 months, I expect, and then 5 months from now, that's when the trade deadline is roughly, the Falcons will try to make an upgrade there. And, I just don't know who and when that is going to be, but we'll just sort of have to see. But that being said, my conclusion on today's episode is that I think the Falcons have done enough to help Desmond Ridder in terms of the red zone issues, but I certainly think they could do more. And, that's where that Hollins, Renfrow, Corey Davis stuff comes from. But, we'll talk more about the explosiveness potential, right? That if the Falcons, are continue to be this very methodical offense, putting together these 8, 10, 12 plus play drives, I think they'll be able to close that out. And of course, I think the goal, we've talked about this before, where, the Falcons want to run the ball, they want to be efficient on third downs. They want to be efficient in the red zone. If they check all 3 of those boxes, this is going to be a very effective offense. That's going to be very hard to stop. And I've talked about before, that's basically minus the run game, what the 2012 Falcons were. Very good on third downs, very good in red zone, very methodical, the occasional explosive play. And so they check 2 out of those 3 boxes. Hopefully this team will check 3 out of those 3 boxes with the run game added to that. And then hopefully this team can also check a 4th box, right? And that's where the explosiveness comes in. And we didn't get too deep into that on today's episode, but I think that's certainly worth exploring, in the future, probably tomorrow on the podcast. So everydayers, that my biggest question mark surrounding Arthur Smith, dating back to when we first hired him, was his ability to design explosive plays in his various offenses. And whether that was in Tennessee and whether that's been the last couple of years in Atlanta, he hasn't necessarily, won me over in that regard. Like, it's still a question mark to me. And basically Arthur Smith's offense, as far as I'm concerned, tends to be more about having dudes, Derrick Henry, AJ Brown, Bijan Robinson. So I think it's a fair question to have if that is still an issue. Has Arthur Smith, does he have enough dudes on this offense? And things look promising, but that is, I think, worth exploring further. And that, again, will be something that we can, revisit at a future date. And so, we'll see if that style of offense, having a bunch of dudes can work for this football team so that they can check that 4th box, in terms of explosiveness. So that will be in store later this week. We'll have some guests as well. Of course, we'll also be breaking down Clark Phillips a little bit later in the week as well. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, you can subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL podcast, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every